On the morning of October 14, 1896, 4 men left the mining settlement of Eureka, Montana, bound for the telegraph station at Fortine, 23 miles north. None of them arrived. The search that followed would consume 6 weeks, involve 2 counties, and yield only fragments: a tin cup, a boot, and a single page torn from a surveyor's notebook. But no bodies, no camp, no explanation that satisfied the families left behind. The disappearance was not the result of violence, ambush, or epidemic. It emerged from a decision made in full daylight, on familiar ground, by men who believed they understood the country they were walking through. The leader of the group was Samuel Tarrant, 41, a contract surveyor for the Great Northern Railway. His work required precision and isolation. He had mapped sections of the Flathead Valley the previous summer and was known in Eureka as capable, if reserved. He kept his tools maintained, his routes documented, and his appointments. He was not reckless. With him were 3 others. Jacob Lind, 28, worked as Tarrant's assistant and carried the transit equipment. He had a young wife in Kalispell and wrote letters to her twice a week without fail. Daniel Howell, 34, was a timber cruiser employed by the Blackfoot Milling Company. He joined the party to file updated boundary claims at the Fortine land office. And Peter Moss, 19, the youngest, had been hired 2 days prior to carry provisions. He had no formal experience in the wilderness, but he needed the wage. The weather on the 14th was clear and cold. The first frost had arrived 3 nights earlier, hardening the ground and thinning the undergrowth. Conditions were favorable. The route they intended to follow was not a formal road, but it was marked. A combination of game trails, logging traces, and survey blazes that had been used intermittently since 1889. Tarrant had walked portions of it before. He told the storekeeper in Eureka they would reach Fortine by nightfall the following day. They departed just after sunrise. A wagon driver named Amos Cutler saw them leave the northern edge of the settlement, walking in single file. He later testified that Tarrant carried a compass and a leather satchel. Lind had the transit tripod strapped across his back. Howell wore a canvas coat and carried a rifle. Moss was last, bent slightly under the weight of a rucksack that appeared, in Cutler's words, poorly balanced. Cutler watched them until they entered the tree line. He said the morning light was strong and the men moved steadily. There was no indication of distress, uncertainty, or haste. He returned to his route and thought nothing more of it. What Cutler did not know, what none of them knew, was that 2 days earlier, a surveying crew working 12 miles northwest of Eureka had encountered a section of trail washed out by unseasonable rain. The damage was noted in a field report filed with the railway office in Whitefish on October 13th, but the report was not forwarded to Eureka. It remained on a desk beneath other documents until November. Tarrant carried no map that accounted for this change. He relied on memory and on the assumption that the landscape he had known in summer would hold in autumn. That assumption was the first error. The decision to proceed came not from ignorance, but from confidence. Tarrant believed the trail was stable. He believed his knowledge was current, and he believed that 23 miles under clear skies was a reasonable distance for 4 men to cover in a day and a half. He was wrong. The country between Eureka and Fortine in 1896 was not wilderness in the absolute sense, but it was far from settled. The railroad had reached the region only 5 years earlier, and much of the surrounding forest remained unlogged, unfarmed, and lightly traveled. Homesteaders avoided the low valleys due to flooding. Trappers passed through in winter but rarely stayed. The few trails that existed served commercial rather than residential purposes. They connected timber operations, mining claims, and railway depots, not towns. Samuel Tarrant had first surveyed sections of this country in the summer of 1895. His task had been to measure elevation changes and plot potential rail extensions for the Great Northern. He worked methodically, often alone, and kept detailed notebooks. His entries were spare but exact. Bearings, distances, soil conditions, water sources. He noted landmarks, a lightning-struck pine, a stone outcrop shaped like a wedge, a creek crossing marked by a collapsed beaver dam. These landmarks became his reference points. He did not anticipate that they might shift, erode, or vanish. The trail he chose on October 14th followed a ridgeline for the first 7 miles, then descended into a shallow drainage before climbing again toward a plateau that overlooked the Tobacco River Valley. From there, it was a straight descent into Fortine. Tarrant had walked the ridgeline twice before. He knew it to be dry, open, and navigable even in poor visibility. It was the drainage section, the middle stretch, that he had seen only once, and briefly. Jacob Lind trusted Tarrant's judgment. He had worked with him for nearly 2 years and had never known him to miscalculate distance or lose orientation. Lind's role was technical, not navigational. He carried the instruments, recorded measurements, and asked few questions. His letters to his wife, preserved in a collection donated to the Flathead County Historical Society in 1954, reveal a man who was methodical, affectionate, and untroubled by doubt. In his final letter, dated October 12th, he wrote, "We leave Tuesday for Fortine. The weather is fine. I will write again from there." Daniel Howell was less familiar with the route, but he had spent years moving through similar terrain in his work as a timber cruiser. His job required him to assess forest density, estimate board footage, and mark boundaries for future harvest. He understood how to read land and how to avoid becoming lost. He carried a rifle not for protection against animals, but because it was standard practice. He did not expect to use it. Peter Moss was the variable. He had been in Montana for less than 6 months, having arrived from Ohio in May. He worked odd jobs, loading freight, clearing brush, repairing fences, and had no experience with extended travel in forested country. He was hired because he was available, not because he was qualified. Tarrant paid him $1 a day plus meals. Moss accepted without negotiation. The party carried provisions sufficient for 3 days: hardtack, salted pork, dried apples, coffee, and a small quantity of cornmeal. They brought 2 canteens, a tin pot, matches wrapped in oilcloth, and a wool blanket each. The load was not excessive, but it was not light. Moss, unaccustomed to the weight, adjusted his pack repeatedly during the first mile. Lind noticed, but said nothing. The weather held. By midday on the 14th, they had covered roughly 8 miles and reached the ridgeline Tarrant had described. The trees thinned. The ground was firm. Visibility extended for miles in every direction. There was no reason to alter course, but the descent into the drainage was steeper than Tarrant remembered. The trail, such as it was, became less distinct. Blazes that had been clear in summer were obscured by new growth and fallen branches, and the creek that should have marked the low point of the drainage was running higher than expected. Swollen, Tarrant assumed, by early snowmelt from the peaks to the east. They crossed it without incident, but the far bank was soft. Moss slipped once, catching himself against a tree. Howell remarked that the ground seemed wetter than it should be for mid-October. Tarrant agreed, but did not consider it a warning. He believed the plateau was close, perhaps 2 miles ahead. They continued. What they did not know, and could not have known without recent reconnaissance, was that the trail ahead no longer existed in the form Tarrant remembered. The washout observed by the railway crew on October 12th had occurred along a section of hillside just below the plateau. A week of rain in late September had saturated the slope, and a shallow landslide had stripped away the path, leaving a raw scar of exposed rock and loose soil. The slide was not large enough to be visible from a distance, but it was sufficient to erase the trail entirely for a stretch of approximately 300 yards. Tarrant was walking toward an absence, and he did not know it yet. The exact moment when Samuel Tarrant realized the trail had vanished cannot be reconstructed with certainty. No diary entry marks it, no witness observed it. But the sequence of events that followed suggests it occurred sometime in the late afternoon of October 14th, as the light began to weaken and the temperature dropped. The party had been walking for roughly 9 hours. They had covered, by Tarrant's estimation, between 14 and 16 miles. The plateau should have been visible by now, a broad, flat expanse of open ground that would have confirmed their position and provided a clear line of sight toward Fortine. But the terrain ahead remained uneven, cluttered with deadfall and dense clusters of young pine. The blazes that had guided them earlier were no longer present. The trail had dissolved into suggestion. Tarrant stopped. Lind, walking behind him, nearly collided with the transit case. Howell and Moss came up beside them, breathing hard. The air smelled of damp bark and cold stone. No one spoke immediately. Tarrant consulted his compass. The bearing was correct. North-northwest, consistent with the route he had plotted. But the ground did not match his memory. The slope to their left was too steep. The creek they had crossed an hour earlier should have been the last water before the plateau, but they could hear running water again, somewhere below them, moving fast. Tarrant frowned. He took 3 steps forward, scanning the hillside, and then he saw it. The landslide scar was not dramatic. It was a raw, diagonal gash, perhaps 50 feet wide, cutting across the slope at a shallow angle. The soil was dark and loose, studded with broken roots and scattered rock. The trees above and below the scar were intact, which made the damage easy to miss from a distance. But up close it was unmistakable. The trail they had been following ended at the upper edge of the slide and did not resume on the far side. Tarrant stood at the edge for several seconds. Then he turned and walked back to the others. "There's been a slide," he said. "The trail's gone." Howell moved forward to look. He knelt at the margin of the scar, testing the soil with his hand. It crumbled easily. "Recent," he said. "A week, maybe 2. Lind set down the transit case and wiped his forehead. "Can we go around it?" Tarrant considered. The slope above the slide was too steep to climb safely with full packs. The slope below dropped sharply into thick brush and what sounded like a fast-moving creek. Going around would mean backtracking at least a mile, then attempting to flank the slide by traversing uncharted ground. It would cost them the remainder of the daylight. "We can cross it," Tarrant said. Howell looked at him. "You sure? It's not wide. We go one at a time. Test each step. It'll hold." Moss, who had been standing several paces back, spoke for the first time in hours. "What if it doesn't?" "Then we backtrack," Tarrant said. "But I don't think we'll need to." This was the decision. Not reckless but calculated, not desperate but impatient. Tarrant believed the slide was stable enough to cross. He believed the distance was manageable, and he believed that turning back would cost them more than pressing forward. He was prioritizing time over caution. It was a choice rooted in experience. He had crossed worse ground before, but it was also a choice shaped by fatigue, fading light, and the desire to avoid explaining a delay to the clients waiting in Fortine. Howell did not object. Lind nodded. Moss said nothing. Tarrant went first. He moved slowly, placing each boot with care, testing the soil before committing his weight. The surface was loose but not liquid. Small stones shifted under his feet, but the underlying structure held. He kept his eyes forward, his arms slightly extended for balance. 10 feet, 20, 30. He was halfway across. Behind him, Lind followed, carrying the transit case in both hands. His steps were cautious, deliberate. He did not look down. Howell went third, the rifle slung across his back. He moved faster than the others, perhaps too fast. Near the center of the scar, his left boot broke through the surface crust and sank to the ankle. He stumbled, caught himself, pulled free. A small cascade of loose dirt slid downslope. He paused, then continued. Moss was last. He hesitated at the edge, shifting the weight of his pack. The straps had been cutting into his shoulders all day, and he adjusted them now, loosening the left side. The pack tilted. He corrected it, stepped forward, and began to cross. He made it 15 feet before the soil beneath him gave way. It did not collapse suddenly. It settled, a slow, sinking subsidence that pulled his right leg down to the knee. He dropped the pack instinctively, grabbing for purchase. His hands found nothing but loose dirt. He slid 3 feet downslope, then 5, then stopped, wedged against a half-buried root. Tarrant turned. "Don't move!" Moss froze. His breathing was rapid, audible. The slope below him was dark with shadow. The sound of the creek was louder now. Howell started back toward him, moving carefully. Can you reach my hand? Moss stretched upward. Their fingers touched, but did not lock. Howell shifted his weight, leaning farther. The soil beneath him shifted. Stop, Tarrant said. Howell stopped. For several seconds, no one moved. The light was failing. The temperature had dropped noticeably. Moss was chest deep in loose soil, braced against a root that might hold or might not. Tarrant looked at Lind. The rope. Do we have rope? Lind shook his head. It's in his pack. The pack was 5 feet below Moss, half buried, unreachable. Tarrant exhaled slowly. He looked at the slope, at Moss, at the failing light. Then he made the second decision. We pull him out, he said. All 3 of us. We anchor on solid ground and pull. It was not a good plan, but it was the only plan that did not involve leaving Moss where he was. They positioned themselves at the upper edge of the scar. Howell reached down, gripping Moss by the wrist. Lind took Howell's belt. Tarrant braced behind Lind, hands on his shoulders. On 3, Tarrant said. They pulled. Moss came free. Not cleanly, but in a sudden, violent lurch that sent all 4 men sprawling backward onto stable ground. The pack remained below, lost. For a moment they lay in the dirt, breathing hard. Then Moss sat up, coughing. His trousers were torn. His hands were raw. Tarrant stood first. He looked back at the slide, at the pack half visible in the shadows below, at the creek beyond. We keep moving, he said. This was the 3rd decision. The final one. They had lost the pack. They had lost the rope, the extra blanket, and half their food. It was nearly dark. They were off the trail, disoriented and without clear reference points. The rational choice would have been to stop, make camp, and reassess in the morning. But Tarrant believed the plateau was close. He believed they could reach it before full dark, and he believed that stopping now would only compound their difficulties. So they continued north, into the trees, as the last light drained from the sky. No one saw them again. The first indication that something was wrong came on the evening of October 16th, when Samuel Tarrant and his party failed to arrive at the Fortine telegraph station. The station operator, a man named Elias Kern, had been expecting them. He knew Tarrant by reputation and had been told to hold a parcel of survey documents for his arrival. When Tarrant did not appear by nightfall, Kern assumed a delay, weather, equipment trouble, a detour. He did not report it. By the morning of the 17th, concern had spread. Jacob Lind's wife, waiting in Kalispell, had received no word. Daniel Howell's employer in Eureka sent a rider to Fortine to inquire. The rider returned that evening with confirmation. The men had never arrived. A search was organized on October 18th. It began with a small group, 6 men from Eureka, including Amos Cutler, the wagon driver who had seen the party depart. They followed the trail north, moving quickly, calling out at intervals. By midday, they had reached the ridgeline. The weather had turned. A cold rain began to fall, steady and soaking. They found the first trace near the drainage, a tin cup, half buried in mud near the creek crossing. It was identified as standard issue, identical to those carried by logging and survey crews throughout the region. There was no name on it, no distinguishing mark, but its presence confirmed the route. The search party continued. The rain intensified. Visibility dropped. They reached the landslide scar by late afternoon and stopped. The scar was obvious now, raw and unstable. The rain had loosened it further. Small streams of runoff cut through the exposed soil, carrying debris downslope. Cutler stepped to the edge, looked across, and shook his head. They didn't cross this, he said. They might have tried, another man replied. They searched the area until dark, calling into the trees, scanning the slope below the scar. They found nothing. The rain did not stop. The search resumed the following day, October 19th, with a larger party. 14 men. Some from Fortine, some from logging camps farther north. They spread out, combing the drainage and the hillsides above and below the slide. One man discovered a boot lodged between 2 rocks near the base of the slope, 30 yards below the scar. The boot was worn, waterlogged, and missing its laces. It was later identified by Peter Moss's landlord in Eureka as consistent with the type Moss had been wearing, though positive identification was impossible. No other physical evidence was found that day or the next. The rain continued for a week. The creek swelled. The search was suspended on October 24th due to deteriorating conditions. It resumed briefly in early November when the weather cleared, but yielded only one additional item: a single page torn from a surveyor's notebook, discovered by a trapper nearly 2 miles north of the landslide. The page contained a column of figures, bearings and distances, written in pencil. The handwriting matched samples from Tarrant's previous work. The page was damp, but intact. It had been protected, perhaps carried in a pocket, then lost or discarded. The numbers on the page suggested Tarrant had been attempting to navigate by dead reckoning, but the final bearing was incorrect. It pointed northeast, not north. If followed, it would have led the party deeper into uncharted forest, away from Fortine, toward terrain that became progressively steeper and more difficult. Theories multiplied. Some believed the men had become disoriented after crossing the slide and wandered into the wilderness. Others argued they had attempted to descend into the drainage and been caught by the rising creek. A few suggested they had encountered an accident, a fall, an injury that prevented them from continuing. None of these theories could be confirmed. No bodies were recovered. No camp was found. No further evidence emerged. The official search concluded on November 28, 1896. The Lincoln County Sheriff's report, filed in December, listed the men as missing and presumed dead. The cause was recorded as exposure and disorientation following navigational error. The report noted that the trail between Eureka and Fortine had been known to be unstable and recommended that future travelers avoid it until formal improvements were made. Jacob Lynn's wife filed a petition for a death certificate in January 1897. It was granted in March. Daniel Howell's employer submitted a claim for the loss of company property, which was denied. Peter Moss's family in Ohio requested information in February 1897, but received no answer beyond what had already been reported. Samuel Tarrant's notebooks and instruments were never recovered. The Great Northern Railway reassigned his contracts to another surveyor. His name appeared in one subsequent document, a payroll ledger from 1897, which listed him as terminated due to absence. The landslide scar remained visible for several years. Photographs taken in 1899 by a railway engineer show the slope partially healed, overgrown with brush, but still identifiable. By 1910, it had been absorbed into the surrounding forest. The trail itself was abandoned. A new route, wider and graded, was constructed in 1903, following the valley floor rather than the ridgeline. It avoided the drainage entirely. In 1954, a hiker discovered a rusted compass embedded in the bank of a creek approximately 3 miles northeast of the landslide site. The compass was submitted to the Flathead County Historical Society, where it was catalogued but never definitively linked to Tarrant. The mechanism was frozen. The needle pointed southeast. No further discoveries have been made. The file on the Tarrant party occupies 11 pages in the Lincoln County Archive. It is stored in a gray box alongside other incomplete cases from the 1890s, mining accidents, drownings, unexplained absences. The paper has yellowed, but the ink remains legible. The handwriting is careful, bureaucratic. It records names, dates, expenditures. It does not speculate. I first encountered the case in 2003 while researching early survey work in the Flathead Valley. The disappearance was mentioned briefly in a footnote, a cautionary example of the risks faced by contract surveyors in unmapped country. I requested the file out of routine curiosity, expecting nothing more than a procedural summary. What I found was something else, a narrative constructed entirely from absence. There are no photographs of Samuel Tarrant, Jacob Lynn, Daniel Howell, or Peter Moss. No sketches, no portraits. Their faces are unknown, but their movements, on October 14th and 15th, 1896, can be traced with surprising precision. The testimony of Amos Cutler establishes their departure. The discovery of the tin cup places them at the creek crossing. The boot and the notebook page mark the approximate boundary of the search area. And the compass, if it was indeed Tarrant's, suggests they veered east into country that offered no shelter, no landmarks, and no exit. The question that persists is not what happened to them, but why they continued. After the landslide, after the loss of the pack, after the light failed, Tarrant had experience. He knew the risks of night travel in forested terrain. He knew the value of patience, and yet he chose to press on. Perhaps he believed the plateau was closer than it was. Perhaps he feared the consequences of delay, professional embarrassment, lost contracts, disappointed clients. Perhaps he simply miscalculated, as all of us do, the margin between confidence and error. The land has changed since 1896. The Great Northern Railway extended its lines, then abandoned them. The forests were logged, replanted, logged again. The towns grew, then shrank. Eureka remains, smaller now, quiet. Fortine is still there, a handful of buildings along a county road. The distance between them, by modern highway, is 17 miles. It takes 20 minutes to drive. But the old trail is gone. The ridgeline has been subdivided and posted with private property signs. The drainage has been rerouted by culverts and gravel turnouts. The landslide scar, if it still exists, is indistinguishable from the surrounding slope. The ground has healed. In 1998, a group of amateur historians attempted to retrace Tarrant's route using the 1896 survey notes and modern topographic maps. They began at the northern edge of Eureka and followed the approximate bearing Tarrant would have used. Within 4 miles, they encountered discrepancies. Landmarks mentioned in the notes, a lightning-struck pine, a stone outcrop, had vanished or shifted. The drainage had changed course. The ridgeline was no longer accessible without crossing private land. They abandoned the effort after 2 days. I think about this often, the way a landscape can erase itself. The way memory, even documented memory, becomes unreliable. Tarrant believed he knew the country. He had walked it before. He had measured it, recorded it, made it legible. And yet it was not the same country on October 14th that it had been in summer. It had changed in ways too small to map, but large enough to matter. The families of the missing men received no closure. Jacob Lynn's wife remarried in 1899 and moved to Seattle. Daniel Howell's brother searched the drainage for 3 consecutive summers, finding nothing. Peter Moss's mother died in 1903, still waiting for word. Samuel Tarrant's sister submitted inquiries to the railway company, the sheriff's office, and the territorial government. All were answered in the same way. The men were gone, and no additional information was available. The last entry in the Lincoln County file is dated March 12, 1912. It is a brief note, handwritten, stating that the case was to be transferred to inactive status. No further action was required. The file was closed, but the question remains. Not the mystery of their fate, that is in all likelihood settled. They walked into country that did not forgive miscalculation, and they did not walk out. The question is smaller, more personal. What did Samuel Tarrant see in that final hour of daylight on October 14th that convinced him the risk was acceptable? What did he tell himself as he led 3 men into the dark? We cannot know. The archive does not record thoughts. It records only actions and the consequences of actions. On a topographic map of Lincoln County, dated 1897, there is a notation along the eastern edge of the Tobacco River drainage. It is written in small, precise letters, almost invisible unless you know to look for it. It reads, "Trail abandoned, not maintained." The notation appears on all subsequent maps through 1920. After that, it disappears. The trail is no longer marked at all. It is as if it never existed, but it did exist. 4 men walked it, and somewhere in those trees, in that country that has since grown over and moved on, something of them remains. Not bodies, perhaps, but the shape of a decision. A moment when confidence exceeded knowledge. A choice that seemed reasonable, even necessary, and proved to be neither. They thought the trail was safe. It was not, and that single miscalculation, made in good faith on an October afternoon, became the last decision any of them would make. The file is still there, In the grey box in the archive, the case is closed. But the question is not. It never is.